Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about one of the most pressing issues of our time. That's the persecution of religious minorities in India. And as you said, the Nazification process that is underway over the past nearly a decade now. And I think it is one of the matters that should demand our immediate attention, as it strikes at the very heart of human rights, religious freedoms, and for every minority to live a life in peace and with dignity. Almost 4 summers back in 2020, I was a journalist back in Kashmir, the Indian administered Kashmir, and I had to take this very painful journey from Kashmir to the US to live as a journalist in exile. And my story to exile is also a kind of testament to the harrowing reality faced by Muslims in India and Kashmir today. And since the rise of the present Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Hindu supremacist government in 2014, almost 250 million Muslims and Christian minorities are living in constant fear, devoid of their human rights, religious freedoms, and dignity. And this number, 250 million, constitutes a significant portion of humanity, which is 7 times the population of Canada and 2/3 of the American population. This particular ideology that I talked about, the Hindu supremacism, it aims to transform India into a Hindu nation, and it is this particular ideology that has fueled this whole persecution that we are seeing in India today. The progenitor of this hateful ideology is a group called Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS, which was founded in 1925 and inspired by a host of different fascist movements in Europe back then. And its early founders and ideologues admired Nazism. They openly wrote it in their books, and I read a lot of their stuff, a lot of their literature. And they were strong supporters of Hitler. The present ruling party, the BJP, is the political wing of RSS. And it is also, at the same time, essential to acknowledge that, similar to RSS in India, Canada has witnessed the establishment of a parallel RSS infrastructure in the form of organizations such as Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, Vishwa Hindu Parishad of Canada, Seva International Canada, Ekal Vidyalaya Canada. And we have a very similar infrastructure here in the US as well that sends money back to India to fuel hate and violence back home. And as a result, what we are seeing today are the stories that are coming out of India of families being torn apart, a nation that is manufacturing refugees out of its own Muslim citizens, innocent lives lost, homes demolished, mosques and churches vandalized, and minorities pushed into ghettos who are living in constant fear of riots, pogroms, and large-scale genocidal massacres. And these individuals are no different than you, me, anyone else in Canada, in North America. They desire nothing more than to live in peace, practice their chosen faith, and build better lives for themselves and their families. But disturbingly, what's going on in India has resemblances in the past. Like Justice for All Canada has produced this wonderful report that I read, and I've been talking about this for a very long time, that what's happening in India, because I have studied Germany under Nazis and the persecution of Jews, and I live in DC, just a couple of miles away from the Holocaust Museum, and I pretty much know like what's going on in India, how it relates to what Nazis did to Jews back in Germany. And the resemblances are striking between both these persecutions that happened back in time and that are happening right now in India. In Nazi Germany, discriminatory legislation such as the Nuremberg laws targeted Jews, just as India has enacted the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens, which threatens to render millions of Muslims stateless. Similarly, India has seen the introduction of love jihad laws, banning interfaith marriages, echoing the ban on marriages between Jews and Germans under the Nazi regime. And the explicit and systematic targeting of Muslims in India, this destruction of their properties and places of worship, is reminiscent of the pogroms against Jews in Nazi Germany, where they were attacked, arrested, their businesses and synagogues destroyed. And additionally, the beef ban in India shares parallels with the Nazi prohibition on kosher slaughter. And in the realm of information control, Joseph Goebbels, the chief propagandist of the Nazi Party, had complete authority over the flow of information, utilizing mediums like film and radio to promote Nazi achievements. In India, we have the IT cell that exploits social media platforms, while primetime news, there's a big infrastructure. There are a lot of primetime news channels in India. They are owned by corporations that are closely tied to the BJP and the RSS, and they serve as its propaganda tools. Moreover, just as Nazi Germany indoctrinated students through schools, in India, what we are witnessing is a similar pattern where the government and Hindu ideologues have revised the curriculum, removed Muslim history, promoted, and they're promoting Hindutva ideologues who harbor disdain and hatred for Muslims and Christians. In Nazi Germany, thousands of books were burned for being un-German. And in India, we are seeing a similar trend where the government has banned thousands of books by calling them anti-India or anti-Hindu. And in fact, 2 years back, Genocide Watchdog issued a genocide alert for India, placing it at the 8th stage of its 10-stage model of genocide. That means, to put in simple terms, that India is 2 steps away from genocide. India is already at the 8th stage. It has already checkmarked the 8 stages of genocide. And the man who issued this alert is the same man who issued alert for genocide in Rwanda. In fact, the US Holocaust Memorials Museum's Early Warning Project has also ranked India among the top 10 countries likely to witness mass killings in the near future. And we also, when we talk to folks here about persecution, what's going on in India, the general answer is that there are still democratic institutions that can save the country. But let me tell you, the pillars of rule of law, including the judiciary and police in India, are on the edge of collapse. The government has imprisoned country's best intellectuals and journalists who dare to question its discriminatory policies. Hindu extremists operate with impunity, with some even being released prematurely, emboldening their extremist actions. And the shocking approval for the release of 11 Hindu extremists convicted for the brutal gang rape of a pregnant Muslim woman and the murder of 14 of her family members during the 2002 Gujarat pogrom is just one example. And when the BBC recently released a documentary highlighting PM Modi's direct role in this violence, the government imposed a blanket ban on its dissemination. And personally, I also run a research project called Hindutva Watch, where we document hate crimes and hate speeches delivered at Hindu far-right events. And we have seen a steady rise in speech where extremists openly call for sexual violence against Muslim women and advocate for economic boycotts of Muslims and genocidal massacre. For sure, that's the core almost in every other speech. And some Hindu militant groups tied to the RSS and PM Modi's party are distributing weapons, swords, spears to millions of Hindus across the country. And we are documenting it. It's on our website. Go check it. It's on our Twitter. And they're urging them to prepare for a war. And we are not that naive what kind of war it would be and who that other is against whom they are preparing for this war. And in fact, a few months ago, I worked on a story with the Wall Street Journal where we uncovered members of Hindu militant groups buying firearms through Facebook groups, illegal firearms. It's illegal to have a weapon, to own a weapon in India. You need a license for that. But these groups like Bajrang Dal, they are buying weapons on Facebook groups. The current reality, in fact, what I spoke about earlier, the past couple of minutes, this reality in India may look very bleak, but I think it's still not too late to reverse the damage caused by the radicalization of the Hindu far right. And it's it's on our shoulders that we prevent India from becoming another Rwanda, Bosnia, Burma, or China, for that matter. And countries like Canada shouldn't treat human rights and religious freedom as a tradable commodity and utilized only when geopolitical interests are at stake. The Canadian government must call on the Indian government to take immediate steps to end the persecution and protect religious minorities. And we must understand one important thing, that this particular issue transcends India. It impacts the entire world, as it will have a ripple effect on regions and global stability. And we are talking about 3.2% of world's population at risk of mass violence, and which, if starts, could engulf the entire subcontinent. And in conclusion, I would urge the staffers or the parliamentarians who have joined here to push the Canadian leadership to engage in diplomatic dialogue with their Indian counterparts, express concerns over violations of minority rights, and also, as a state, they should allocate resources to support international human rights organizations like Justice for All and others, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, who are monitoring the situation in India. And it's also crucial to explore opportunities for providing assistance and support to the organizations working on the ground in India to safeguard the rights of religious minorities. And I'm quite hopeful that Canada, a country that has welcomed millions of Indian immigrants, will continue to embrace its responsibility in upholding the democratic values it cherishes dearly, and it may work towards defeating the forces of hate and division within its borders and in India, and bring relief to the countless individuals who are currently being persecuted just because of their faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Raqib, for that presentation. Like my friend was just saying, the issue of Hindutva and this kind of nationalism that we're seeing ascendant in India has long globalized into a kind of international problem, and is a problem or an issue that I think Canadians can't really afford to ignore, as it has really for years now, in fact for decades, become something that has affected our civil society and social fabric very much here in Canada for since some years ago, as I'll show. So I think I'm a writer right now and a kind of communication specialist for the National Council of Canadian Muslims, but I'm not here representing them. I'm taking some time off of my work today to present as an individual here at Justice for All Canada. But since we're talking about Canada and so on, I thought I'd provide some of the information on this issue from a kind of domestic angle. That is to say, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the mother organization of the Bharatiya Janata Party that has won big parliamentary majorities in 2014 and 2019 in India, very much has arms and reach internationally. And that includes many countries in the West. It certainly includes the United States. It certainly includes Canada. It certainly includes Australia, parts of Europe, as we'll see. And just to give you guys a snapshot of Canada today, I think would illustrate just how extensive that kind of internationalism is when it comes to justifying, promoting the ideas and the worldview of the RSS, of this kind of Hindu nationalism, and to legitimize it in the eyes of lawmakers across the world, policymakers, and so on. So I have here, for example, just as the title slide, the very first, I think, convening of Hindu Heritage Month last November, which is not too long ago. And this is obviously something that sounds very innocuous, and certainly the idea of celebrating, cherishing any kind of cultural heritage or religious heritage is not just a good thing, but rather a kind of duty we have here as a multicultural society in Canada. Except in this case, in November, this Heritage Month was convened by organizers and also members of Parliament. In this case, someone from the from Ottawa, from the Nepean region, riding in Ottawa. It was convened under the saffron flag of the RSS, which is generally specified as the most important symbol, as a kind of within the RSS ideological hierarchy, a symbol that rests on the very top of that hierarchy in terms of representing India as a nation run by and for its Hindu majority first and foremost, like my friend had just mentioned a few minutes ago. And of course, that kind of exclusivist, exclusionary ideology has its effects. And it's an effect, its effects, I think my friend was just outlining, that has very troubling implications given the kind of affinity that, or the origins of this ideology in the early 20th century and its adherence to exclusivist, often kind of racist or ideological views that parallel with fascism, with Nazism in the 20th century Europe. And if you read some of the literature by the founders of RSS ideology, of Hindutva ideology, you'll see that this is the case, as I've outlined here. In Canada, I have to say this issue has not really, it's been covered, I think, a bit more in recent years, but for the, for some of the Canadian audiences that might have not been paying attention up until now, it's been getting a lot of traction actually in the United States, how sort of this ideology or people who represent this kind of foreign, these set of foreign interests have intervened in elections, for instance, or have tried to sort of insert themselves into the electoral process in one way or the other, legitimately or otherwise. It's a topic of much discussion in some of the US press and some of the UK press, but almost none of the of Canadian media. And it's not, and we're hoping that's changing now, given the concerns we have, for example, from the Muslim community here in Canada and beyond, as a kind of Canadian issue for Canadian civil society. And I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the RSS here in Canada, but it really started an interest, I think, wider interest on this issue kind of started a few years ago during the beginning of the pandemic, when everything was shut down. And if you remember, the beginnings of the pandemic kind of overlapped with the holy month of Ramadan for a lot of us here in Canada, the Muslim community in Canada, well, across the world, really. But that meant during the pandemic, we couldn't go to the mosque because everything was shut down. And so various municipalities across Canada passed motions or sort of temporary policies where we could, where various mosques could broadcast the call to prayer, the adhan, across, wherever they are, for like 5 minutes a day. And this triggered a kind of backlash on social media from voices that, upon further investigation, basically were connected to groups like the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, or HSS, which is the premier kind of leading foreign lobbying and community organization outside of India for the RSS that is in charge or responsible for organizing the Indian diaspora according to the ideologies and sort of pseudo-religious beliefs of the RSS. And that backlash was actually covered by the CBC, by various outlets in Canada, including by myself. At the time, I was writing for the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, and that kind of is the beginning of our media interest here in Canada. And hopefully that's not the end of it. So National Council of Canadian Muslims has put out a report about the RSS network insofar as we can tell its structure in Canada. Basically, without going into extreme detail, there's three kind of aspects to this presence in Canada, including number one, the humanitarian relief aspect or part of that structure, which is basically registering, Seva Canada is the organization, like my friend was saying, that is responsible for collecting money or fundraising money for humanitarian, supposedly humanitarian reasons here in Canada, where it is called Seva, SEWA or SEVA Canada, and is registered as I believe, as a charity here in Canada, a CRA charitable status since for decades now. And that money, if you take a look at the actual filings on the CRA website, is then sent to India for reasons that are only known really to the RSS network or the people running the various organizations in India affiliated with RSS and representing, working for the various RSS organizations in that country. So it's not really spent here, obviously. Just not to say it's a problem, but the money, however, hundreds of thousands of dollars is sent to India. I mentioned the HSS already. Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh represents the overseas sort of interest when it comes to community organizing. There are other organizations in Canada affiliated with this RSS network or the Sangh network that are more political and so on. But the HSS has embedded itself in Canada for a long, long time. And its branches are actually, if you look up their just HSS Canada websites, their activities and so on, community organizing activities are listed to be hosted on the within the campuses of Canadian high schools and elementary schools. That's in, at least across the Greater Toronto area, that is the case. So from, Toronto and Durham school boards and so on, and Peel as well. If you go on their Facebook page, you can see, some of the stuff they do. I mean, these are absolutely kind of community organized community events, but at every single one of them, you'll see that the founders of the RSS, their portraits and a portrait of Mother India as a kind of Hindu sort of like figure is presented, and there is a veneration for these figures and these ideologies. So when adults, children, and so on are kind of organized and preached to according to these ideologies. You'll see that the Hindu Heritage Month as well takes place on this setting as well in our schools. And here are a couple of here's some material from Hindu Heritage Month in last November in a school, I believe, in somewhere in Brampton. Material is actually taken from the United States wing or the branch of the HSS. And if you look at the right slide there, it actually says that Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism are just parts of, subjugated parts of Hinduism. And of course, people from these Hindu community or from the Sikh community spoke out against this kind of misappropriation of an independent world religion or their religion. Again, there are plenty of organizations here in Canada, including this thing called this organization called the VHP, which has been called out in the past for participating in mass communal violence earlier in the 2000s, in particular, by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, for participating in essentially primarily anti-Muslim pogroms in parts of India. And they are, they do host events and have status, sort of, I believe, charitable status here in Canada as well. And thirdly, aside from the community organizing and the Seva International stuff around humanitarian relief, there's also the political the actual explicit political representation of RSS ideology and the BJP here in Canada. Usually in the, they're called the Overseas Friends of the BJP in the United States, in Australia and elsewhere, but they've changed their name here in Canada to the Canada-India Global Forum, where they host BJP officials and discussions and to promote the ideas and political agenda of the BJP here in Canada. All of that sounds fine, except when you take a look at the actual social media accounts, for instance, of some of the leadership of the so-called so-called leadership or self-appointed leaders of some of the community here in Canada. So if you look at the person who is affiliated with the Canada International or Canada-India Global Forum, which represents the BJP's interests, that's a guy named Anil Shringi, and you can see what he has to say. That is to say, once in recent years, at least, when it comes to rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric from parts of the sections, segments of the Hindu Canadian diaspora, it has gotten really very, very Islamophobic. It's gotten very bad. And they're just examples of how this ideology, how these issues kind of affect the discourse here in Canada and the kind of social discourse and the social fabric here in Canada, and how it really poses a problem in terms of increasing tensions, increasing provocations, and very hateful rhetoric between communities. That's the end of it. There are references available on the NCCM website. You can take a look at this if you like. There's the report I mentioned, and you can message me about it when if you guys want further information. So thanks.
It's an honor for me to share a panel with such distinguished panelists. I would specifically appreciate Raqib for his courage as a Kashmiri. I know how hard it is these days due to transnational depression of the Indian state. My name is Tazeen Hassan, and I serve as an advocacy manager associated with Justice for All Canada. In the context of today's deliberation on the topic of the rise of the right-wing Hindutva organizations and Nazification of India, I feel compelled to share that both my parents were born in India during a period when the foundations of Hindutva ideology were being transformed into violence against Indian minorities. Over the past 75 years, this ideology has gained unprecedented power as a political group within and outside the borders of India. As we gather here to deliberate on the pressing issue of Nazification of India, it is imperative that we acknowledge the gravity of the situation and recognize that it extends far beyond the borders of India. As Zhou mentioned, I would like to highlight that many of my relatives still reside in the Indian province of Madhya Pradesh, where the demolition of Muslim houses began during the holy month of Ramadan in 2020. My esteemed colleagues have already presented crucial insights into the topic of Nazification of India and its impact on Indian minorities. Allow me to contribute by shedding light on certain aspects of Nazification, import in Canada, and Canadian domestic and foreign policies that may accelerate the import of Nazification into Canada. It is crucial to recognize that the repercussions of this Nazification extends far beyond India, as I mentioned, and Zhou also mentioned that. The RSS founders aspire to propagate this ideology globally. Historical records reveal the establishment of the first overseas branch of RSS, HSS, Hindu Swayamsevak, back in 1944. And it comes as no surprise that the branches in Canada and the UK emerged as early as the 1970s. This powerfully toxic ideology has been gaining influence in the Western world through thousands of overseas branches that exploit diaspora populations for their agenda for about 50 years now. Experts like Azad Isa, Peter Frederick, Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay have documented and underscored the notable influence of RSS through its influential lobbying groups, which yield significant power in the parliaments of influential Western nations and global institutions. These groups have raised funds for the destruction of churches, Gujarat massacre in the past, weaponizing elements like non-violent persona of Gandhi, yoga, and Bollywood. Particularly, Bollywood has played a role in vilifying specific religious communities, notably Muslims. Recent Kerala story and Kashmir files, which serves as just two instances among a multitude of others. Now, I would like to address the most crucial issue at hand. I urge you to focus on a significant matter that requires urgent attention. Ignoring this alarming development could lead to an unprecedented increase in the import of Nazification in Canada. A crucial development occurred on June 5, 2023, that simply cannot be disregarded. In a statement, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's National Security Advisor explicitly identified India as one of the major sources of foreign interference in Canada. This acknowledgement should undoubtedly serve as a wake-up call for the Canadian government, compelling them to thoroughly reevaluate their domestic and foreign policies and approach concerning the cultivation of relations with India. It is disappointing that both the Liberal government and the Conservative opposition have completely ignored previous warnings from federal agencies about the political Indian interference, further adding to the seriousness of the issue. Experts and academics emphasize the need to reconsider the influence of local Indian diaspora politics in Canada while trying to advance relations with India. I would like to share a personal observation where at least one member of parliament and one member of Alberta Legislative Assembly have personally informed me that they received threats from certain Indian groups when they attempted to speak out against the aggressive policies of the Indian governments towards minorities and Kashmiris. But here arises the pivotal question. If India is recognized as the primary source of interference in Canada, it prompts us to inquire about responsibility. I firmly believe that certain domestic policies unintentionally foster an environment that is conducive to such interference. In this context, I invite you to analyze a specific domestic policy and its potential impact on Canada as a nation. As stated on the official IRCC website, immigration website, Indians received the highest number of Canadian immigration visas, comprising 27% of the total in 2022. In comparison, their closest competitor, Chinese immigrants, receive a mere 7.2% share. However, it is concerning to note that individuals from countries such as Ukraine, the Uyghurs, Rohingya, Afghanistan, and Kashmiris from Indian-administered Kashmir, who face the imminent threat of genocide and war, receive only a fraction of the immigration visas. So this immigration policy is a grave injustice to these indigenous minorities facing genocide, war, and discriminations in their home countries. These statistics provide important context to the statement made by National Security Advisor regarding India's significant role as a source of foreign interference in Canada. Allowing such a substantial percentage of visas to be granted to a single country can be seen as an explicit invitation for interference by Canadian policymakers. It is worth noting that this statement from the NSA is supported by previous warnings from federal agencies. This should serve as a wake-up call for Canada to not only reconsider its foreign policy, but also its domestic policies concerning immigrations. Failure to do so will only result in the acceleration in the process of interference, but also compromise the diversity of Canadian society, allowing the import of Nazification that would pollute Canadian values and divide the Canadian population. Thank you.